The next day broke to a freezing cold December morning. The frost-covered ground was as hard as concrete underfoot. By the time the two girls had woken up and come down to the kitchen for breakfast, Mr. Hines had already been out to tend his sheep and put the horses in their field. "Morning, girls," he said, while crouching by the Aga, trying to warm through his cold body. "Far too cold to be out on the ponies this morning. I've just had a tug of war with Boris trying to get him out of the stable." As soon as he saw the frost, he refused to leave, knowing that it meant he'd be in the field all day. "I had to bribe the old nag with yet more food." This made the sleepy girls chuckle. Izzy had never known luxury like this in all of her life. Usually getting out of bed was a horrendous task in the winter. You had to plan before bed the night before where all of your clothes were going to be positioned so that you did not freeze to death while getting dressed. This morning she was able to wake, stretch her arms out of the bed, check her phone and leave the safety of the blankets, all without getting cold once. Mrs. Hines came through from the utility carrying an armful of washing that looked like it had just come out of the dryer. "Fold these for me, please, girls, while I make a start on breakfast." Mrs. Hines plonked the washing on the kitchen table, and the girls started to sift through the sheets and towels, folding together the larger items like they'd been doing it together all of their lives. Izzy thought it was so strange that she and Pamela were so similar and compatible, and yet all of those years at school and on the school bus she'd thought her friend to be such a completely different league to herself. Yet here they were, working together, as if they were twins and had never left each other's side. Izzy was snapped out of her thoughts by the sound of sausages and bacon sizzling on top of the Aga. The smell that filled the room was just delicious. It really made Izzy feel all festive, as the Henley family only had a breakfast like this on special occasions, like birthdays, Easter, or Christmas. When all four of them were sat down to the table tucking into their delicious breakfast, Mr. Hines asked out of nowhere, "So Izzy, this pony parade at the village fair, what are you going to be doing? Do you already have a pony on loan for the event?" Poor Izzy's heart sank right through her body and onto the floor. It was a topic that she had spent the last 24 hours desperately trying to avoid, and Pamela had had the good grace not to bring it up, knowing that her friend was excluded from the merriment of the occasion. No, Mr. Hines, I do not have a pony to take to the parade. I am going, though. We go to the fair every year to see Santa giving the sweets out to the children, and also sing a few carols," Izzy replied. It was such an awful subject to bring up when Izzy had tried her hardest not to think about the whole thing in her attempt to live her life more like Jack's. "Well, if you're going anyway, would you mind doing me an awfully big favour?" asked Mr. Hines. "Yes, if I can," replied a quite confused Izzy. "It's Boris, you see," began Mr. Hines by way of an explanation. "All of the other four beasts are going, so Boris is going to be home alone, and as I'm the designated Santa this year, poor Boris does not get to take part, and if there ever was a born show-off, it would be him. You would be doing us all a huge favour if you would say yes to taking him and dressing him up for the event." Izzy couldn't believe her ears. "I'd absolutely love to," she said, in what she hoped was a normal tone. "I'd love to take Boris, he looks such a sweet horse, and dressing him up. Oh yes, please, that would be just super. I would really love to, if you don't mind." "Mind? Gosh, no, of course not," said Mr. Hines, a huge grin on his face. "I would have minded a whole lot more if I'd come home to that nag sulking like a baby because he'd been excluded. Like I said, by taking him, you'd be doing us all a favour. Well, that's sorted then. Mother, when you take Izzy home, will you run it past Mr. and Mrs. Henley? Won't you, just so that the plan can be set in concrete?" "Yes, dear. What an absolutely super idea. The girls and I can all get ready for the parade together and then ride into the village leading the two smaller ponies. It sounds like huge fun," Mrs. Hines replied to her husband. "Well, that's that then. All sorted. But Izzy, remember Boris is a very close relation to a mule. He can be a ploddy monster at times who needs a bit of encouragement to go in a forward motion," Mr. Hines said, laughing at his imaginary image of his stubborn horse. "Daddy, stop being horrid about poor Boris," Pamela started. It's really super of you letting Izzy take him. And you know he's only a plod because you can't ride properly. Izzy will be just brilliant on him. We are going to have so much fun planning it all, but we only have a few days to do it in. The fair is on Thursday, Christmas Eve, and today is Monday, so we've got loads to organise. Not today you won't, said Mrs. Hines. We're all going to be very busy over today and tomorrow with pre-arranged family visits. Yuck, said Pamela and her father simultaneously. Very funny, you two, started Mrs. Hines again. It's Christmas. Where is your festive spirit gone? Anyway, you are both going and that's that. Come along then, you girls. The day is getting away with us and we have to take Izzy home and talk to Mr. Prest about those sheep. Trot on and get ready. By 10 a.m. Mrs. Hines was in the Henley lounge chatting to Izzy's mother. It was all arranged. Boris was to have Izzy as his mount for the parade, and she was going to go back to the Hines' farm on Wednesday, and all three of them were going to organise costumes for the 5 horses. All of a sudden, Izzy's life was changing in ways that she never imagined possible. It was only a few days ago on Friday that Izzy had felt so isolated and desolate at the thought of being left out of the fair when all of the other girls were going to take part. But now, even though she did not have her own horse, she was to borrow Boris, and for the first time in her life she felt included, like she actually belonged to the community that surrounded her. No longer was she to sit just to the side of everyone else, watching them live their lives. She was actually living it with them, and it felt so good. Over the next few hours, Izzy was bursting with excitement, telling her mother everything about her stay. She had long forgotten that it was her treacherous mother who'd instigated the whole event in the first place by asking the Hineses if Izzy could go over. She told her mother all about the ride, the Hineses' house, the food, the heating, the horses, the jumps in the wood, everything. It sounds like you had a lovely time, darling. Now please, if you don't mind, can you stop rabbiting on about it and go and fetch the Christmas decorations down from upstairs, and we'll start to dress the house. Daddy is bringing home a tree from the woods, so if we get everything ready we can all decorate it together after tea. Not long later, and Izzy re-emerged, dragging Jack with her as they both carried with them boxes full of Christmas decorations. Most of them were handmade. They'd been made by either Izzy or Jack at school over the years and were so precious to the family that no one wanted to part with them. So every year, without fail, the boxes came down and the cottage got dressed with the same ornaments that it did every year. Homemade paper chains were pinned around the lounge. Christmas cards were blue tacked to the walls in lovely patterns. 4 stockings were attached to the fireplace, well out of the way of the fire, and all the baubles and tree tinsel from many years past sat in their box, waiting for the tree to arrive so that they could adorn its many branches and bring its spirit back to life, even if, after a few weeks, the tree itself would in fact be dead. "Hello, hello, it's only me," came a voice from the door as Mrs. Prest, the farmer's wife, entered the little cottage. Mrs. Henley and Mrs. Prest were great friends and were often around each other's houses trying to help out with each other's jobs the best that they could. "Come in, we're in the lounge," called back Mrs. Henley. "Well," Mrs. Prest sighed, taking in all of the decorations, "doesn't this look just grand with all of the colour and glitter? What a lovely job you have done with the place. Well done." "Thank you," smiled back both Jack and Izzy. They too were rather proud of their room decorating skills. "It's actually young Izzy I've come to see," Mrs. Prest continued. "I've had the Hineses over to see me this morning, and they happened to mention a fancy dress parade in the village on Thursday." "Well, young lady," said Mrs. Prest, looking at Izzy, "I may have just the thing for you. Many years ago I got dragged to an awful fancy dress Christmas party, and the theme was cowboys and Indians. I went as a kind of Hiawatha character, but with it being winter, I sewed into the costume leggings and a vest, and the rest of it is made out of very thick felt material. And there's even a poncho to keep you extra warm, if you would like to borrow it." Mrs. Hines suggested that all you needed to do was take the saddle off Mr. Hines' horse and put a few brightly coloured handprints on the horse's rump, and that really should be that. Apparently you are against the clock getting ready. What do you think? "Thank you very much," Izzy replied. "I'd love to borrow your costume, and I've always wanted to play real-life cowboys and Indians," Izzy blurted out before she had time to check another one of her childish fantasies that she had sometimes played out while wandering around the farm, just like she did nowadays with her fantasy show Pony Prancer's Dance. "Great, that's settled then. Apparently all of the costumes are going to be put together on Wednesday, so why don't you come around Wednesday morning and collect the costume? Then Mr. Prest can take you over to the Heinz's farm when he's returning the sheep he borrowed. Save your poor mother the journey. This time of year is busy enough without having to make extra trips out." "Thank you," said both Izzy and her mother at the same time. "That is very kind of you. Thank you very much," continued Mrs. Hanley. "I'll send Izzy around first thing Wednesday morning so Mr. Prest isn't waiting around for her." "Great stuff," replied the farmer's wife. "Oh, and Izzy, I thought you might like this," and out of her very large coat pockets she brought out a copy of the Yorkshire Post. "It's just full of images from the local horse trials, and I thought you may like to look at it." With that, Mrs. Prest thrust the paper towards Izzy and was out of the door, again calling over her shoulder, "Moustache, see you Wednesday morning. Please try and make it before 8 a.m. There's a dear." Bang, click came the familiar sound from the hallway, and she was gone. Izzy opened the paper that was in her hand. "Wow," she said out loud to no one in particular. The pages were full of the horse trials. It had been an international event with competitors attending who had come from all over the world. There were stories of victories and tragedies from the 3 days that the event had been held over, and just dozens of pictures of all of the fancy horse boxers, grooms, riders, and of course the magnificent horses themselves. "Mummy, please can I be excused and go and read it?" Izzy asked her mother. "Yes, dear, but if you mean to go to the coach house, like you usually do, then please wrap up extra warm, as I cannot be doing with nursing you if you get poorly so close to Christmas. I'm far too busy for that." "Oh, thank you," Izzy replied, and with that she leapt towards her mother, kissing her on the cheek, and dashed up to her room to put on as many clothes as possible to keep the bitter December chill out. It wasn't long before Izzy was racing down the stairs again and out of the front door. Click, bang, click went the latch as the hall mirror as she dashed out of the house. She jumped the gate into the sheep's field in front of the Henleys' kitchen window and strode the few metres towards the permanently propped open door that led to the horse stalls. This was Izzy's most favourite place in the whole world. It was 6 individual horse stalls, separated by 5 wooden and cast iron partitions that sloped from the ceiling of the room right down to Izzy's head height and were topped with iron spheres, the same design as the brick and concrete gateposts that led to the front of the coach house. Each stall had beautifully decorated mosaic tile feed troughs with a large ring, where Izzy could always imagine the horses being tied to when they were feeding, and above the troughs large wrought iron hay racks so that the horses were never short of feed. The floor had an intricate pattern of drainage channels so that little gullies under the horses' feet where their waste would run down the slightly sloping stalls from the trough to the end of the wooden partitions, where there was an even larger drainage gully that took the waste to a drain and away from the beautiful animals Izzy imagined once lived in there. As far as Izzy knew, the building had not even seen a horse for the past 50 years, but with the hay and straw still thrown around the place from where occasional sheep came to stay, it just looked like the horse had been out for the day, but could return at any moment. It was this closeness to the very animals that were the object of Izzy's passion that led this place to be her most favourite in the whole world. "She's here," Izzy suddenly heard someone whisper from inside the stalls. "Who's there?" she called out, terrified of what the response might be. She heard the gentle patter of feet running away from her and then stopping dead. "Is it time to tell her?" Izzy heard the voice again. Her blood turned ice cold in her veins, and the goose over grave came with a shudder down her spine. "Who are you, and what do you want from me?" called out Izzy, too scared to turn and run away. She was close to tears. She was petrified by the whispering voices, as she could clearly see that there was no one else in the stalls with her. "She's scared. Don't be cruel. Give her your present, Tom," Izzy heard the whispering continue. She could make out that it was a girl whispering. She sounded younger than Izzy. "Okay, okay," replied a boy's whispering voice. "Eve, pass it to me then." Izzy stood stock still. Every fibre of her body was telling her to get out of there, but she couldn't. She was frozen solid with fear of the unknown. "Who are you?" Izzy gasped out, her heart beating so fast she thought she was going to faint. "Please don't be afraid," came the boy's voice. He sounded like he was a very similar age to Izzy. "Please don't be scared of us. We promise that we mean you no harm. I have a present for you. Please trust me and open out your hand. Close your eyes and count to 10. Izzy felt in a trance. She did not want to do what they had said. She wanted to turn and run away, but she couldn't. She was frozen to the spot. So she went against all of her natural instincts and closed her eyes, while holding out her heavily shaking right hand. Suddenly she felt something tickle her palm. Her eyes shot open, darting around the stalls for any sign of life, but there was none. She looked down to her trembling hand, and there, placed in the centre of her palm, was a small bundle of about 20 grey horsehairs, tied together by what looked like an old dirty piece of ribbon. "What is this?" she asked the empty room. "We cannot tell you yet, miss, but all will become clear eventually, I promise. But please don't fear us. We mean you no harm." With that, Izzy could hear the 2 sets of feet running away in a light patter, as they must have run out of the coach house. Izzy stood blinking to herself. She must be dreaming. Did that actually happen? She looked down at her palm. The horsehair was still there, tied in the dirty piece of ribbon. She turned it over several times between her fingers. Yes, it was definitely real. So did that mean that the whole experience was real? Was she really just talking to 2 children that were not actually there? Had they been the giggling children in the pergola? Were they the shadows she had seen in the pine wood near Mrs. Hines's jumps? She had so many questions that she needed answers for, but she had heard them run away. Who were the children? And why did they seem so interested in her? Especially now. She was only just building up the kind of normal life that she'd always wanted, with horsey people who were soon becoming horsey friends. Who would believe her? Who could she go to? Then she knew the answer. An explanation would probably come through Mr. Elliot, the old gardener. He'd known from the very start, when she had told him about the giggling. He knew the secret things about Redock that no one else did. Her mind was made up. She was going to find him and ask.